Hello and a warm welcome to Personal Finance. I'm Gugulethu, Cele. Now today we sit down with Rene Grobler. She's the head of cash investments at Investec. Now this is to get a better understanding, now that July has come and gone, which was National Savings Month in South Africa, how South Africans can implement practical steps to ensure that they boost their savings before we reach the end of the year. Rene, thank you so much for joining us. A real pleasure having you on today. Maybe if we start by painting a picture of the South African savings landscape. Just how dire is the situation?
Thank you very much, Gugu. It's such a pleasure to be here. The savings landscape in South Africa, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, really doesn't look fantastic. And when I say that, I mean it in the context of a global environment. So our savings rate at the moment is somewhere in the range of 13% of GDP. And that, if you compare it to international counterparts, is really a sad state of affairs. And even when you look backwards and you say, back in the 1990s or even early 2000s, what was our savings rate? It was above 20% of GDP. Sure. So if you look at the environment at the moment, you know, it doesn't look pretty, and there are many reasons for the fact that South Africans are saving less. But I think just on that stat, it's quite important to understand that that is a combination of government savings, private sector savings, and household savings. So it's not just households, it also is a combination of those three tiers of savings, which then combines into a statistic of around about 13.2% of GDP.
Rene, you mentioned the different reasons why South Africa has a very low savings rate. Maybe if you can walk us through some of them, because I take it differs from a household to corporates not saving that much. What do the reasons entail?
So from a government perspective, you know, the savings on the government side is the net balance of what government is spending versus the taxes that they collect. And I'm not going to go into detail, but if you look at the government deficit at the moment, you can see that actually government is a net spender and not a saver. So that's not helping our ratio at the moment. Secondly, the private sector is actually the only sector that's significantly saving at the moment. So that would be your companies. And when we talk about savings, it's actually their cash on balance sheet. So this would be the cash that they hold for distributions or for capex expenditure or for a rainy day. So the private sector at the moment is actually holding on to some cash, and I wouldn't say at exorbitant levels, but really being prudent around keeping some cash reserves. If you think about what's going on in terms of the electricity crisis, it is prudent to make sure that you've got some emergency reserves as a company. And then on the individual front, I think there are many reasons why on the household savings side, South Africans are really struggling to save. If you look at unemployment, at the moment we're sitting at around 26% unemployment in South Africa, which is extremely high from even an international perspective. And that really makes it hard. When you don't have a job, when you don't have income, it's very hard to save. So that's the first thing. You know, the second thing is look at our debt levels. South Africans at the moment have a 80% debt to disposable income ratio in South Africa. That means if you look at your income, 80% of that goes towards servicing debt. Now that makes life very difficult if you're trying to save, because you still have expenses over and above your house, your car, and any other debt that you might have. And that is really, you know, some of the things that's really impacting on South Africans. Another factor is really what we call the sandwich generation. We've got a sector of our economy, which is the middle-aged sector, of people who are supporting not only their children, but also their parents, because their parents maybe don't have enough money saved for retirement. So the middle-aged population is helping both the elderly generation and the younger generation, and that's putting a strain on our population.
On this topic of saving, Rene, it almost seems as though there needs to be a mindset change. How do we begin to implement that so that people understand why savings is so important?
I think the mindset change is a very tough one. Most people will tell you, I don't have enough money to save. And I think that is the first place to start, is instead of necessarily banging people on the head saying you're not saving enough, we need to educate. I think education is, for me, the key here. It's not only basic level of education, but it's also financial literacy. I think when people start understanding the impact of one not saving, what that can do, and you just have to look at a population that hasn't saved enough for retirement to scare you. Greece, exactly. But then also the positive side of that is remind people why they're saving. I think that often helps. It's a bit like a diet, Gugu. You know, when you're trying to diet, the only thing that stops me from grabbing that chocolate is remembering why I'm dieting, rather than depriving myself of the instant gratification. And I think that's the same when you're saving. Remember, you're saving for your child's education, or you're saving for a comfortable retirement, or you're saving for that house that you're trying to afford, the deposit on that house. And when you start doing that and you remember that saving is actually a form of paying yourself first, you know, that is when you're going to start the discipline, I think, of saving. And then also just educating people on things like compound interest. You know, the impact of starting early. If you started in your 20s, just putting a little bit away every year, you know, the impact of that over years and years of compound interest and growth on that investment will make a significant difference when you're 40, 50, 60 years old.
I like the analogy of the diet that you used just a moment ago, because it sounds as though South African consumers really need to be incentivized to save. And we've recently seen the government introducing tax-free savings account as a method to help South Africans save. But maybe walk us through your interpretation of these tax-free savings accounts and how, as Investec, you happen to be approaching them.
Sure. I think tax-free savings is a really good step by National Treasury and by government to incentivize the average consumer to save. I think tax-free savings is not a new product per se in the market. All it is another way to save. It's another incentive to save. So many companies have brought out different ranges of products, ranging from, you know, your traditional bank account, savings accounts, all the way through to share portfolios and your unit trust investments and the more aggressive type investments and passive trackers. So there's a wide range to choose from. And I think the first tip that I would give people is just understand that the considerations when you save in a tax-free account is the same as it would be in when you're investing in general. So you need to think firstly about your risk profile. You know, what am I prepared to risk in my investment? The second thing is, how long am I planning to invest this money for? And I wouldn't say that tax-free savings is there for emergency funds or short-term savings. It really is designed for longer-term savings. Because remember, if you take out your maximum of 30,000 Rand in a particular year, you have access to it. But if you withdraw it, you can never replace that year's particular savings, and you lose out on all that compound interest. So the real benefit of a tax-free savings account is if you're going to invest for the longer term. You have the ability to access that money, which is fantastic, so you don't have to worry that it's locked away in case of an emergency. But my suggestion would be that you actually plan to leave that money for the longer term. And therefore, you know, if you look at the range of products, you know, you need to think about your term for investing, your risk for that particular investment. And there might be people like retirees who don't have that much time left in terms of their investment objective, or there might be risk-averse people who would like a more conservative view, and that's where Investec's cash investment products really come into play.
I'm happy you've highlighted the fact that tax-free savings accounts need to be used more for the long term. What does this tell us about consumers and the kind of products that they need to make use of to have additional emergency funds, almost like a variety of savings pots?
Yes, so if you look at your savings, I think you should be bucketing most likely, and I'm not giving financial advice. I think it's important that you consult your financial advisor to help you with your strategies. But in general, what you would see is people investing either for the long term, which would be mostly for their retirement. And there you need to think about strategies like using retirement annuities, maybe even life products, endowments, share portfolios, anything that will give you a higher return over a longer investment period, because you need to keep track with inflation. And the inflation outlook at the moment is about 5%, but still you want to make sure that you don't erode your hard-earned savings by not keeping track with inflation. So that's a longer-term investment strategy. Then you have your medium-term strategies, which would be your goal-based savings, as I mentioned earlier, for education potentially, for university for your children, for that home, for that holiday. And there you need to think about how long you want to invest your money, and that will dictate to a large extent the products that would be most suitable.
Rene, in South Africa though, we also saw the MPC. They recently increased interest rates by 25 basis points. That's the repo rate. What kind of benefit though does this have for the South African saver?
Yes, so the interest rate hike is very positive for savers, and I'll explain it in the following way. You know, if you look at inflation outlook at 5% at the moment, depending on which cash investment product you are invested in, you know, it ranges at the moment at Investec, your rates would range between 5.5% and 7.5%, depending. Beating inflation, yeah. Exactly. So depending on how long you invest your money, you would have an inflation-beating investment in cash, which hasn't necessarily been the case, you know, for the last few years. So you have an opportunity to at least keep track with inflation. I think here it is important to think about what type of product you invest in, because even at the instant access level, you have different products. So you could have a product that is prime linked, which means when the prime rate moves, your investment rate also moves. So that would mean for clients who were invested in a prime linked call account, when the rate went up, immediately their interest rate also went up. If, as an example, you had a 6-month fixed deposit, you were invested at a fixed rate. So depending on what the rate at that point was, you might have got the benefit if the market was pricing in an interest rate hike, but not necessarily. So that's a fixed rate product. Or what we also offer, and most banks offer, is a money fund tracker product, which is based on the money funds in the unit trust environment. So if the money fund rates change, you know, then your rate will also change. So you need to take careful cognizance of which of those products you're invested in. But in general, for savers, the higher interest rate is a good thing. Yeah. I do think, though, for the general consumer, as I said earlier, it's actually a problem. Because if you think about it, how are you going to afford this 80% debt that most people sit with in terms of their disposable income? So that would mean that your debt levels are increasing, you have to service that debt, and it could also mean that people have less available for saving. So even though those who are saving will benefit, those who are trying to save might find it a little bit harder.
Rene, we've certainly said quite a bit in our conversation today, but for the person who's catching the tail end of this discussion, what key takeaway points do they need to remember when it comes to the importance of savings?
I think the first thing to remember is why you are saving. Make sure that you understand the reasons behind your saving, because that will also dictate the products that you need to utilize, whether they're longer term or shorter term. And I would also advise people, you know, we've got a really good base of financial advisors in South Africa. Go and talk to one of them, because they are the experts in this area and they will be able to help you in making sound financial decisions. But the last thing I'd like to leave people out there with is, I really believe that compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. Yeah. So start early. It's never too late, but the earlier you start, the bigger the benefit will be at the end of your objective for saving.
Rene, thank you so much for your time. It's certainly been a great pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks, Gugu.
Well, that was Rene Grobler, who's the head of cash investments at Investec. We've certainly learned quite a bit about the importance of savings, and we'd be happy for you to share your feedback with us. So get in touch via Twitter using the account name at CNBC Africa, #Finance410, or even send through your feedback to myself at Gugulethu on Twitter. Until next time, we'll see you again on Personal Finance.